Hey guys, Potato Whiskey here, and welcome to my video on orb walking in Albion Online. Now, what is orb walking? Orb walking is basically how you move while attacking in a top-down RPG game. You can do it in games like Dota 2, you can do it in games like League of Legends, you can do it in all sorts of, generally speaking, top-down games with some sort of auto-attacking mechanism. I'm going to show you an example of it here. Okay, so I'm going to attack this monster, I'm going to move a little bit, then attack again. And I'm roughly not losing any DPS, even though I'm moving in between each attack. And that's because of how attack animations and how the attack bar works in Albion Online. Basically, there is a internal cooldown that happens when you trigger an attack, and you're locked into the animation for about 16 frames if you're running at 60 FPS. I have my game locked to 60 FPS right now. And then you can move, and then you will attack again if you're holding down the spacebar. I tend to just try and time it by pressing spacebar every 1 second, because that's my attack speed. I'll show you that in a moment. In here. I'm using a tier 2 bow, just so there was a long period there of attacking so you could see how it works. I have an attack speed of once per second, so that means I need to press my spacebar once every second to attack while moving. So pretty much all I'm doing is I'm holding down left click and then pressing spacebar with my enemy attacked, and I'm able to move, cast a spell. And you can even get even more advanced by weaving in abilities. That's kind of more advanced stuff. I'm not going to work on that right now. I'm just kind of introducing you guys to the idea of orb walking. Alright, so this is how auto-attacking works in Albion Online. So if you imagine that this green bar represents a second of time, if you have a weapon that attacks once every second, you attack here, and then you get to this bar, and then you attack again. And imagine this bar, when you get to the end of the bar, you loop back to the start. Okay, so you attack, get to the end of the bar, you attack, okay? So how it actually works is that you don't need this full bar to complete an auto attack in Albion Online. You actually only need about 0.27 seconds, which is actually, I measured this, it's about 16 frames, okay? 16 frames if you're running at 60 FPS. So how it actually works is, okay, you initiate the attack here, your character is locked into an attack animation, then your character finishes the attack, and then you have 0.63 of a second. If your weapon has a 1 second attack speed, you have 0.63 of a second to do things like movement, to do things like abilities, all that sort of stuff, before your next attack comes off cooldown, where you press spacebar to attack your enemy, and then you go through your attack animation again, and then you reach the green bar once your attack animation is finished, where you can move and do other stuff. And then when you get to the end of this green bar, you loop all the way back to the start, and you do the same thing again. You press spacebar, you attack, and then you can move, attack, and move. And that's basically how orb walking works, okay? Because you don't need, if your weapon takes 1 second to attack, you don't need the full second to complete the attack. You only need, at 60 FPS, 16 frames to complete your attack. And when you finish your attack, you can use an ability, you can use potions, you can do all that other stuff without interrupting your next attack. There's also another thing that you can do, which is kind of advanced, is actually what you can do is about 50% of the way through the frames of your attack, you can use an ability. And the attack will go through, and a second timeline will be created for the ability, and you can kind of get a double hit in really fast. I think that's called animation cancelling. That's another really advanced technique that I'm going to talk about another time. But just, if you don't understand this, I'm going to show you some gameplay footage in a bit. But basically, you attack, and you're locked into the attack where you can't move, and your character completes the animation. Then you can do other stuff, like moving around, targeting different stuff, and your character is free to move. And then when you get here, you want to press spacebar, take some timing to learn and do. You can also just hold down spacebar, and I think that also works. But once you get here, if you don't press spacebar in time, you're lowering your DPS. That's another thing I'll talk about. But basically, you want to press spacebar right here on this frame. It's basically, it can be a frame perfect trick, but if you miss like 2 or 3 frames, it's not a big deal. And what this allows you to do is chase more effectively. It allows you to run away more effectively. It allows you to avoid AoEs more effectively. If you can execute this reasonably well and only lose a couple of frames per attack, it makes you so much better than an average player who just sits there and attacks people regularly and uses abilities. If you can learn how to master the attack upswing, and this is the downswing, this is the attack upswing, this is when the attack is executed, and this is the downswing where you don't need to do anything. You're not forced to do anything, and you can do other things with your character. This is really common in games like Dota 2, League of Legends, I think even, I'm trying to think of another MOBA, but I can't. But yeah, pretty much all games that use this sort of attack system, you will have an animation that you're locked into, and then you'll have a window where you can do other stuff, and then you'll attack again, and you can attack again, and you're locked into that animation, and then you can move again. So now that I've covered like the basic introductory concepts of what orb walking and attack animation, locking and backswings are, I'm going to talk a little bit about the advantages of orb walking and why you want to do it. Okay, the main reason you want to do it is the ability to move while a worse player is not moving, okay? If you're using the time in between your attacks to do other important things, you're going to be able to get more done. For example, in a chasing scenario, in a being chased scenario, it allows you to reposition in between your auto attacks. A lot of people who've played AD carry in League of Legends will understand this, and pretty much anyone who played at a relatively high level in Dota 2 will also understand this. It's essentially just being really efficient with your movement and attacks. And that's why you want to do it. You want to do it because it gives you an advantage over other players. Now, there are downsides to doing it, and I'm going to talk about those in a little bit, but I just want you to understand why you do it. You do it because it gives you an advantage. It makes you more efficient, but there's a caveat there. It technically, if it's not executed well, it will lower your potential DPS, at least with your auto attacks. So you're going to want to occasionally just stand there and hit stuff if DPS is super important. Just click on people and then don't press anything else. You're also not going to want to do it if you can't do it very well, because you will just be lowering your DPS and running into AoEs on accident. So it's not for everyone, but for players who really want to have an edge and be better than people, that's why you do orb walking. So this video actually started off being fairly simple, about me just explaining how orb walking worked and what are the advantages of it, why you should do it. But then I started to dig into numbers and I got kind of into a black hole of analysis. So I'm going to kind of show you some of that right now. There's a lot here, but basically what I did is I ran a couple of tests. Now my methodology for these tests were I recorded myself playing, I was attacking an enemy and I wasn't moving at all. I went back over the footage frame by frame to determine the exact frame that an attack landed and counted the frames between each attack to get a baseline measurement of how long an attack takes. I chose the frame where the blood spatter appears on an enemy, as it seemed to be a consistent animation, as well as it seemed to sync with the character changing direction during the single frame when you could continue to orb walk after your attack had finished. I recorded myself doing the exact same thing, attacking an enemy, only I was orb walking. I was moving in between my attacks. I then went through that footage frame by frame and counted the frames between each attack landing and was able to measure the amount of DPS I lost from orb walking and how much movement I was able to do in a fight in exchange for that DPS I lost. I had my frame rate locked to 60 frames per second and I recorded the game at 60 frames per second, so they synced up pretty nicely. I actually discovered that an attack animation is about 16 frames long, and attack speed does not speed up the actual attack animation. It speeds up the cooldown between your attack, which, that means since it takes about 16 frames per second, it takes about 0.27 seconds to complete an attack where you're locked in and can't move, and then you've got about 0.63 of a second to move before you have to press spacebar or whatever you bound your attack target key to before you can attack again. So in the first trial, I simply ran up to an enemy and stood still while attacking them. I did dodge one ability, but I made sure to attack the target well before my target came off cooldown. In the first trial, it took me exactly 60 frames per attack, which is how many frames in a second, which matches up perfectly with the 1 second per attack on the two-handed sword. At some point there was a frame added in here or there, but generally my character attacked every 60 frames. I think that might have been like a little bit of server / my computer simulation desync. So I think that kind of tells us that the server tick rate and my personal tick rate, that's my FPS here, if they don't line up perfectly, there will be a little bit of a mismatch in the exact displayment. I'm pretty sure it works almost perfectly, that you get exactly one attack every second. Okay, so onto the interesting part. In the second trial, I did the exact same thing, but I attempted to move around the enemy in between each animation while pressing spacebar whenever my auto attack was ready. So in the second trial, I had an average of 65 frames per attack, or 1.0 seconds per attack, or 0.923 attacks per second. Now, while I did technically lower my DPS a fairly significant amount in Trial 2, it's important to remember that this is a trade-off for moving in between attacks. Additionally, it's possible to execute this perfectly or near perfectly to the point where you're only adding a couple of frames or none at all to your attack. I was able to execute a few attacks in a row perfectly, timing it to be exactly 60 frames in between my attacks, which means it's theoretically possible to orb walk with 0 DPS loss. Now, of course, that would take superhuman execution, but for most people, as long as you're executing orb walking reasonably well, the mild loss in DPS is absolutely worth the mobility you gain in a lot of situations. The important thing to keep in mind, however, if you're executing orb walking poorly, it might just be better to stand still and attack your opponent. If you're losing too much DPS because you can't do this trick, you shouldn't attempt to do it. You should go into PvE, do some expeditions and practice it there before you bring it out into the open world. I think it's a very powerful skill and you should try to practice it, probably, as I said again, in expeditions, because slightly lower DPS doesn't have any major consequences other than taking a few more seconds to finish each fight. It's a really nice and safe place for you to practice this skill if you're not used to it, so that's why I recommend doing it. This bit of analysis, for some reason or another, it led me to be curious about how would attack speed affect things, so I ran the trials again with plus 12% attack speed slotted in from my assassin's chest. I was curious, does increased attack speed mean that your attack animation goes through faster, or does it simply mean that the cooldown between attacks is shortened? By measuring very carefully and analysing the footage frame by frame, I managed to come to the conclusion that a two-handed sword attack animation was about 16 frames long. This equates to roughly 0.27 seconds per attack, leaving you with around 0.63 seconds to move around your enemy until your next attack. So for the curious, how did plus 12% attack speed affect things? Well, in the first attack speed trial where I stood still and whacked the enemy, I had an average of 54.69 frames per attack, or 0.91 seconds per attack, or 1.097 attacks per 7. That's about a 9.7 increase in observed attack speed, which is suspiciously close to the 1.1 attacks per second displayed in your character sheet when you have a plus 12% attack speed buff equipped. I have a couple of hunches as to why this is happening, but I don't have an explanation as of yet. That's something I'm working on, and testing this would take some time, and this video is getting long already. My best guess is that the game does some rounding in your attack speed up or down to make things easier, or I'm just measuring things poorly. I have another idea that's really complicated to measure and explain, but it basically has to do with attack animation upswings and downswings and the internal server tick speed. But really the best answer I can give right now is that I have no idea where that last 2% of my attack speed is, and I'll try to figure it out. We're here for orb walking, so let's get back on track. How does attack speed affect orb walking? In this trial, I'm assuming my previously measured numbers from the static plus attack speed test are accurate, and using those as a baseline and comparing my performance in the orb walking trial to those numbers. Well, in this trial, things went a little bit wrong. My attacks were on average 61 frames apart, roughly 11% slower than in the standing still trial, which equates to about 1 attack per second. The only real conclusions I can take from this is that the higher your attack speed, the harder it is to use orb attacking efficiently, and I'm actually just not that good at orb walking as I thought I am. I did manage to get a couple of perfectly spaced attacks in my second trial, but it was much rarer than in the first trial that I ran. The main conclusion here is that if your weapon attacks faster, you have less time to do things in between your attacks, and it's harder to execute orb walking efficiently. I think magic weapons, this is particularly important for because they attack quite quickly, so you may not want to do orb walking if you're using magic weapons. So having looked at all the data and all that other stuff, and having made the recommendation of doing it, now that I've done the testing, what is my verdict on orb walking in Albion Online? I would say it's essential for anyone who's looking to really up their game and stand out in a PvP environment. I think if you're not doing orb walking and you have the ability to do it, you're basically just giving up an advantage over everyone else who doesn't have the ability to do it. You should absolutely be orb walking in every situation that you can so that you get really good at it. One thing to just be careful about though is if you're changing weapons all the time and they have different attack speeds, your muscle memory might get in the way of you executing correctly. I would suggest really hammering out one weapon and practicing it as much as possible so that you can execute this frame perfectly or near frame perfectly so that you only lose a couple of frames every attack. You can execute this frame perfectly and theoretically lose 0 DPS, but I don't think anyone would be able to realistically in a large fight be able to execute it. Hopefully this has explained orb walking, what the advantages are, why you should do it, how you should do it, and what the trade-offs are. If there's anything I left unanswered about orb walking, please let me know. But other than that, I want to thank you guys very much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial video, and I hope it helped you learn to be better at the game. I'm Potato Whiskey, and I want to say thank you very much for watching. I love you all very much. Bye bye.